Okay, if everybody could make their way to a seat, I think we're going to get started. Yeah, okay. So welcome to Buell Week here at the GSAPP and downtown in Midtown at MoMA. With our colleagues at the Museum of Modern Art. And I'm Reinhold Martin, the director of the Temple Hoyne Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture here at Columbia. And I really do sort of sincerely welcome you all to what my colleague Barry Bergdahl described this morning at the press opening for Foreclosed, the exhibition with which this screening is connected as the midpoint of a ongoing process, which is really intended to generate a kind of broader conversation about housing, cities, suburbs, and crisis in this country and beyond. For the Buell Center, we've been working we've been now counting for the last 3.5 or so years on the question of housing as a subject of public concern and matter of public debate in the United States, and so that's really what brings us here this evening to screen and watch and talk about this very interesting film titled "The Pruitt-Igoe Myth: An Urban History." But before we do that, I'm going to give you a kind of roadmap for what we're going to try to do this evening, but also put in the context of what we're doing the rest of the week. So as I said, this is a kind of kickoff event for a series of activities to do with the exhibition titled "Foreclosed: Rehousing the American Dream," which will be open to the public on Wednesday in the Architecture Galleries at MoMA, co-curated by Barry Bergdahl and myself. And based on research done here at Columbia through the Buell Center. There will be an event on Friday at MoMA, which I have to say I understand is now sold out. That's true, right? Yeah. But maybe, who knows, maybe there's a waiting list or something if you're interested, in which the teams, there are 5 architect-led teams who've designed projects for Foreclosed that they're going to be talking about their work in the afternoon down at MoMA. But if you're unable, and part 2, I should say, of that is this event, What is Foreclosed? Playing on the sort of double meaning of the term that we've been trying to sort of keep in view the whole time we've been working on this. That's a day-long event here at Columbia in the rotunda of Low Library, so in the center of the campus, open to all, wide open. That's kind of the point of having it there. There will be, in a sense, a trace of the exhibition on display in the rotunda all day long, and you can see, I think, the schedule of activity. The basic idea is to bring a wide range of people, critics, basically social theorists, critics, geographers, activists, and so on, to join into a kind of open-ended discussion about the issues that we've tried to put on the table with the exhibition and the context constructed around it. So I very much invite you to come, and there will be sort of a reception, a kind of party at the end of the day, in which we're going to join at around 5 o'clock. Barry and I will be joined by the teams, the architects themselves, to discuss what others have had to say about their work and about the issues that it addresses. And that'll be again in Low Library. So, but here tonight, we're here this evening to basically to watch a movie and talk about it. And that movie, in a sense, revisits the one of the founding images and phenomena and facts, really, that in which the Foreclosed exhibition in relation to which, I should say, the foreclosed exhibition is constructed. Without ever really citing it directly, and that's the demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex here in St. Louis. And to discuss the film, we have our colleague Catherine Fennell from Anthropology, who's been working on, here at Columbia, who's been working on issues of housing and social justice, environmental politics, and so on in her own work, and has been already become an interlocutor, and will join us again on Saturday. So I'll introduce Catherine in more detail in a minute, but first I'll say something about the film. The film, titled The Pruitt-Igoe Myth, An Urban History, is directed by Chad Friedrichs and written by Chad Friedrichs and Jamie Friedrichs, who they also produced the film, together with Brian Woodman and Paul Fowler. It's been screened a couple of times here in New York and in sort of independent venues around the country, and information about it is available on a website, www.pruitt-igoe.com, if you're interested in more information on the film. I'm going to summarize more or less what they say, what the producers and directors have said about their intent, at least, in making this film, and which has, in a sense, caught our attention for these reasons. So Pruitt-Igoe, as you probably know, began as a kind of marvel, a kind of mega project that was meant to realize many of the dreams of modern architecture and urbanism in a somewhat distressed urban context. 2 decades after it was built, it was demolished. This film tells the story of the transformation of the American city in the decades after World War II through the lens of this now infamous Pruitt-Igoe housing development and the St. Louis residents who called it home. At the film's historical center is an analysis of the impact of the National Urban Renewal Program of the 50s and 60s, which prompted the process of mass suburbanization, and thus the context for the foreclosed show, and emptied American cities of their residents, businesses, and industries. Those left behind in the city faced a destitute, rapidly deindustrializing St. Louis, parceled out to downtown interests and increasingly segregated by class and race. The residents of Pruitt-Igoe were among the hardest hit. Their gripping stories of survival, adaptation, and success are at the emotional heart of the film. The domestic turmoil wrought by punitive public welfare policies, the frustrating interactions with the paternalistic and cash-strapped housing authorities, so some of the contradictions, in a sense, of the welfare state, and the downward spiral of vacancy, vandalism, and crime led to resident protest and action during the 1969 rent strike, the first in the history of public housing. And yet, despite this complex history, Pruitt-Igoe has often been stereotyped. The world-famous image of its implosion has helped to perpetuate a myth of failure, a failure that has been used to critique modernist architecture, as is well known to the architects in the room in the citations of this, and the use of the image of the demolition of the building by people like Charles Jenks, Colin Rowe, and others. And a failure that, so it's been used to critique modern architecture, to attack public assistance programs, and to stigmatize public housing residents. So this film, according to its producers, seeks to set the historical record straight. So we could see this as an act of historical revisionism, to examine the interests involved in Pruitt-Igoe's creation, to reevaluate the rumors and the stigma, and, in their words, to implode the myth. So to help us think about this film out loud here in public at Columbia, we, as I said, we're very happy and privileged to have with us Catherine Fennell, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity here at Columbia. Her research follows the transformation of the American welfare state and its effects on the politics of concern, race, and urban redevelopment in Chicago, and more broadly in the American Rust Belt. So, by analogy, with a broader kind of transformation of the Midwestern American city. Her ethnographic and archival work has focused on the built environment, specifically housing, and her recent and forthcoming publications examine materiality and ethical compulsion in the context of Chicago's public housing reforms. And in case you want to read further some of Catherine's recent work. She has a piece out in the journal Ethnography on the question of heat, and in the Journal of Cultural Anthropology, a piece on the new public housing museum in Chicago, which is itself a very interesting phenomenon that we now have a museum dedicated presumably to something that is of the past. And then finally, Catherine has her book project forthcoming is titled sort of beautifully, Last Project Standing, Civic Sympathy and the City Without Public Housing. So I will again have the opportunity to welcome Catherine into conversation after the screening, and in the meantime, and then take your questions, and it'll just be a quick discussion, and really the point is to get a broader discussion going with all of you. And so in the meantime, I'll ask you to sort of last chance for food and wine, and then sit back and enjoy the film. So I think we can start the screening if the folks, yes, we'll just, it's called a speech act. Say it and it happens. There it is. Okay, thanks very much. Apologize for the weather in here. It just happens somehow. We can have those slides going if you like. Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. So I think we'll just offer the floor to Catherine and to get us going. I think she has some thoughts. I'm sure many of you do as well. So I expect that we won't have too much difficulty having a conversation.
Thanks, Reinhold. Can you hear me? Is this better? Maybe you should move closer. Yeah, didn't think so. There are many seats up front. I actually wanted to start with a question to you. Can you hear?
Yeah, you have to go
closer?
A little closer. Yeah.
Better? I wanted to start with a question to you, Reinhold. So I did my work in Chicago at a very different moment that looked in some ways similar, but in some ways different. Starting in 2000, right about the time that Hope 6 is about to roll out on a massive scale, and Chicago becomes a very important experimental ground for this. So part of my work involved talking to a lot of architects and people who had been to architecture school and had gone into policy or development, or lawyers who had gone into development, and part of the work was trying to understand how they imagined their interventions and how they became involved. And so many of them told me the same thing, that they decided to get involved in this kind of work when they watched Pruitt-Igoe come down. And I found this very compelling and very interesting and also very baffling. And watching this helped me understand perhaps how this might have circulated through an architectural imagination. But being before an audience or in an architecture school, I would love to know so much more about that connection and that sort of compulsion to intervene again on a large scale coming up as an architect in this environment.
Yeah. It's a good question. We should certainly try to bounce that one around out in the audience also, particularly with our students. I'd be interested also to hear how they react to this. Certainly the story that you tell is recognizable to me, both generationally and maybe discursively, that these images and the stories that have been, and some of the commentators, these are, some of these are colleagues of ours. In fact, Bob Fishman is coming on Saturday to join in the discussion, so there's a kind of in a sense, long-standing concern within the field of architecture, for which I have to say I think these images, really literally the photograph, particularly the one photograph that has been most widely circulated of this, the first couple of buildings being demolished, have stood in for a critical discussion of the sort that hasn't happened until fairly recently. The other thing worth noting, that actually what, in my case, maybe others too, first caught my attention as a historian, was an article by Catherine Bristol called The Pruitt-Igoe Myth, after which this film is, I think, named, in the Journal of Architectural Education that came out some years ago at this point. I don't remember exactly. And that was really the first time I'd come across a critical assessment, and a more sober assessment, let's say, with different perspectives taken into account, the maintenance issues, the complex reactions of residents, and so on. And it was at least 20 years for that to happen in kind of academic architectural culture, and I think very much at large also. So in a way, I think what we're dealing with in the field, in the field of architecture and urban planning and urbanism, is a delayed, not a reaction, because the reactions were immediate and ongoing, but really a delayed discussion or a delayed sort of opening of the kind of questions that I think maybe some of the people you encountered were themselves, in a sense, enacting that. Yeah. But we should ask them too, but sure, you can surely have other things.
But I'm certainly curious if people want to add to that. These architects would say you just had to, if you saw the images, you would understand why I became involved in this kind of work, and why I thought it was important to become involved in affordable housing, and also why I think it's important for public housing to come down in the 1990s and the last decade. So, pretty strong argument, at least in Chicago.
I'd like to thank very much for holding this up. As you can tell, I'm a hat.
Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. My name is Rod Milam. I'm a 10-year resident of New York City, but a 30-year resident of St. Louis. I was born in 1970, I guess 2 years after, or 2 years before the buildings actually came down. I know that legacy in St. Louis about Pruitt-Igoe, and I was a journalist in St. Louis. I worked at NPR Radio and CBS in St. Louis for about 9 years. I've never seen most of these pictures. I didn't know about it. It was just legacy that kind of came along with me. My parents grew up in the city. My mom was a teacher in the city of St. Louis. She was an elementary school teacher. Was just out of the area of Pruitt-Igoe at the time. But the reputation was kind of known, but it's very interesting. And I actually know Sylvester Brown, who's the first person who was in that film. And it's interesting that you're trying to attach the architectural difference about Pruitt-Igoe, and I did not know that it was stigmatized just because of the architecture itself. Some of the most important parts in the film, and I know that the reasons why that failure happened, number one, it's the St. Louis. I've always found, and I'm working on documentaries on different things about different parts of St. Louis as well, but where I come from is University City. It's not in the city of St. Louis. St. Louis is one of easily the most segregated cities in the entire country on every single level. I'm not just talking about racial segregation. I'm talking about segregated in a political sense, in the layout, and everything else. As they mentioned, and they kind of glossed over it, but I've always found that it's been one of the biggest problems in general, especially compared to Chicago. The city of St. Louis is not allowed to grow. It can't get any bigger, and the city of St. Louis is not part of St. Louis County. The only other city in the entire country that's like that is Baltimore, and I think Baltimore has suffered a lot of the same urban fate as St. Louis because of a structural issue. In the county of St. Louis, it has by far the largest number of municipalities in all of the other counties in the country. At one point, there were 104 different city governments in St. Louis County, and I think the other closest might have been 20. People did not get along. There were nothing but enclaves anywhere. And when I heard some of these people talking about, well, I'm going to move out, I don't want any black people there, I don't want this here, I don't want whatever, it's the history of St. Louis in general. It was a segregated city with a border state or a border town with a border city from the get-go ever since it was a French fur trading town. And to have people get together and work together with any sort of urban planning and everything else has been at the root of the problems of almost everything else that St. Louis has inherited. And especially racially, forget about it. I mean, I've been here too, forget about it. Look, you've got literal redlining that goes on in St. Louis, and it's one of the most segregated places in the world. When they mentioned little outlets, my parents weren't allowed to live. They drew maps. You could go into real estate areas where there were literal red lines. Black, excuse me, black people who live here, white people who live down here, others live somewhere else. And that's how it was. And a lot of it was de facto for a very long time. And Pruitt-Igoe, again, my parents, my father was from, he grew up picking cotton as a little kid, and he came up to St. Louis in the 50s. My mom was from East Texas, and her folks came up right around the same time, but they didn't live there. And Pruitt-Igoe stood out as like a big thing. It wasn't the architecture, but it has so much to do with the environment in which you actually put that architecture. And if it's put in and it is not responsive and is not flexible enough, and you don't build it to actually fit the mood of the city, and the mood, not just the physical plants and the looks of the building, but if it's not met with the maintenance and all of that to be able to put in, you end up with a structure that's just not going to work in spite of the best planning that you have. It's never going to fit, and I think that's one of the best things that this film actually pointed out. And again, I mean, if you haven't, I think that's great. In Chicago, one more thing, at the beginning of the century, St. Louis was the third largest city in the whole country. It was Baltimore, I think Philadelphia, then St. Louis. In 1904, the World's Fair and the Olympics were held in St. Louis. It was the peak of St. Louis. Then Chicago came up because they actually got the city government to work together. And slowly all these people started to siphon off, and all the big business and everything else left St. Louis as well. And you ended up with this big sprawl in St. Louis, mainly because it was racial. And another brilliant point is that people were moving west. I grew up in what's called University City. It was the first town right in the middle of town. If you look down the street, you can see down the center of the arch, but it's outside the borders of St. Louis. And you know, it's the only integrated part, it was the only integrated part in St. Louis. But even then, right around when all of this was happening, when I grew up, I integrated the elementary school that I went to as a kid. And the racial issues are gigantic, but it's really segregated on so many different levels. Pruitt-Igoe is only, it's symptomatic, but I don't know that it could have been designed with all of that in mind. You know, so there were political changes and people were moving out, and the sprawl is gigantic in St. Louis. When they say there are only 300,000 people in St. Louis, the metro area, there are 3 million people. So it's just very interesting. And with other public projects that have built, including the light rail system and everything else, they've suffered the same sort of fate without being able to expand and reach their full potential because of race and people not being able to get along and city governments and all that not working together. So that's all that I have to add as a native and a resident here of New York.
No, I think St. Louis is very particular, and that's sometimes left out of the story. And that's what I like so much about this film. The director said that the directors worked very hard to get a lot of archival footage. Most of this film is archival footage, they said when they spoke about it earlier when it was screened. And most of it is, they got it through, it's not all copyrighted, they've had some problems, right? But there's something different that happens when most of the story is told through these images and through moving images. Because you get a sense that as much as this space became a symbol, right? You have a sense that the space became a symbol for fear and danger and lawlessness. It was also very much a thing. And what I like so much about this film, which is hard to find unless you spend a lot of time reading building code violations and digging in the archives, which is not as fun, is that you get a sense of how complex the social landscape was, but also how complex the infrastructure of these buildings were, and how difficult they were to maintain. How technologically advanced they are, but also how difficult they were to maintain. And that is something that is not a story that comes up very often in discussions of public housing. You hear the crime, the drugs, the segregation, but you don't get a sense of the physicality of it and how complex that was as well. And you mentioned this, maintenance was an enormous issue. So it brings up new questions. If we're going to follow the urge or the lead of the closing line to listen for new lessons, is to think also, how do we integrate a discussion of the social landscape, the material landscape, economic infrastructure, right? That seems to be the challenge for architects nowadays.
And it's the same for anybody who designs a website. People will spend
We're familiar with this.
The consequences when you have a website that sucks is no one uses the website. There's a housing development that sucks every people.
Good analogy.
It's the same sort of mentality that goes into building something. It looks pretty, it's great. It's like, but you build something that nobody can maintain.
Yeah, yeah.
That's important.
That was incredibly compelling to see it.
You can feel free to some.
Thank you.
Go on.
That article by Catherine Bristol is fantastic, by the way. It's freely available on the web. And
Yeah, right.
anybody who likes this film should definitely follow up by reading it. It's a quick read. It was from 1991, actually.
91, yeah.
And what's interesting to me is just that revisionist history that she posits. And so the question is not so much why people see that footage and then decide to become architects, but why they see that footage and they don't decide to become urban planners. Because if you look into the history, it's actually as a result of the urban planners from the Public Housing Authority that actually sort of set up how this stuff should look like. Yamasaki, who was one of the architects, history hasn't been kind to him. He was also the architect for the World Trade Center. He wound up being incredibly frustrated by what was handed down to him by the Public Housing Authority. So they were forced to build things that he originally wanted to build a mixed, like low-rise, high-rise, low-income, middle-income. It was going to be a very diverse kind of settlement. So another aspect of where architecture doesn't really, the failure was preordained, like even before you got to the architecture. A question I have for you guys that I'm curious about is what's happening now with the site, because I know there's a website called Pruitt-Igoe now that there's a design competition, but does it have legs? Is it going to be funded, or should we just turn this into an urban park? 57 acres right in the middle of St. Louis. What could be better? You've already got a bunch of trees.
Do you want to talk about Hope 6, maybe? General, and what's been happening with these kinds of sites around the country?
Yeah, I just saw the website for the design competition, which is interesting because a decade ago there were similar types of competitions occurring all over.
Yeah, Cabrini Green, there was a big one.
All sorts of charrettes, right? You could throw a stone and have a charrette to attend every night in Chicago.
Right.
So I guess what I found, so what's happening with Hope 6? So Hope 6 became thinkable in the early 90s as it became clear that some public housing residents were able to mobilize, not to do a rent strike, but something similar, to sue on the grounds that their houses had been demolished, even though they still stood. So this actually became the site at the center of my research. By focusing on these material conditions, they were able to make the argument that the site had been demolished, even though it still stood, because it was uninhabitable, half vacant, and dangerous to live in. And that was in violation of the 1937 Housing Act, which requires a one-to-one replacement of public housing units. Don't quote me on that, 1937. So if a housing unit is demolished, one must be replaced, right? So this became an enormous headache, not just for the Chicago Housing Authority, but for HUD, how to deal with this problem, because it looked like the case had legs. So what ended up happening is they settled at this one site and then quickly repealed that law to make it possible to actually demolish and not replace on a one-to-one level. So this became the kinds of housing, public housing experiments occurring in the 1990s with mixed income, low rise, right? Probably built according to maybe the original intentions, right? But also in this sort of new urbanist cast. And what I found so interesting about this was that most of the new urbanists that suddenly invaded Chicago in the early 90s and the mid 90s actually cut their teeth in thinking about suburban sprawl and thinking about the problems of suburbia, but that kind of experimentation was not possible to do at that time. It might be now, and that's an interesting moment to think about what's possible now that these other sites, other housing infrastructures are being declared a failure. But they were able to do this kind of experimentation in Chicago and Atlanta, especially Baltimore, Philadelphia, St. Louis, not so much New York. But if you've seen, you'll have to leave to New York to see it, but you'll see this low-rise housing.
You just go to Jersey City, right there.
They all are usually supposed to have some kind of architectural accents that fit the region. So porches in some parts of the country, et cetera. So that's been the prevailing housing policy under Hope 6 for the past decade. but funding has run dry for that too. And there's starting to be lots of questions if that is working as well. So it's another round of experimentation. So there's something interesting in like the architectural imagination or the planning imagination about destruction and then experimentation on a large scale that is worth thinking through. Why is destruction so inspiring for this profession?
Yes, this is a very perverse profession. It seems to enjoy people's houses being demolished. But, yeah, I mean, that was actually, I should add, vis-a-vis your question, also your points, that was one of our motivations here in screening this film this evening and in connecting it with the other things. Because on the one hand, there's the sort of diagnosis. Okay, what went wrong? What's wrong? What happened? Which is now underway. I mean, pretty much this. The articles we're talking about. There's literature now. And then there's the ongoing effect of the story, of the narrative. And I think some of the people in the film actually also mentioned that. And that accounts to some extent for, in a sense, the contradictions that I think you observed with the architects you've met and so on in considering Hope 6. Because on the one hand, there's this sort of perpetuation of the modernist, in a sense, desire to do good with architecture in cities, right? Which is actually rather unique in the bigger scheme of things. The new urbanists, I think, are to be credited with this, that they are actually more modernist than many of the architects who are, in a sense, more stylistically modern, because they have, in a sense, perpetuated the idea that architecture and planning and policy and so on can work together at a fairly large scale to transform cities for the better. However, on the other side of that equation, there is the narrative, I think, more or less emanating out of the ruins of Pruitt-Igoe and of associated events, that says that the locus of intervention, which is to say the public sector primarily, is the definition, is the sort of source of ultimately of the failure. And this is the sort of what's become a kind of refrain in American public life, that same with healthcare and so on, that anything that can be described as a government program is by definition to be suspect and either for whatever reason, inefficient, paternalistic, and so on. So now, obviously, this tells that story in a complex way, and from many perspectives. And I think we wanted to evaluate, in a sense, and challenge the assumption amongst our peers, really, in our field, that by default, as a result of basically 30 years of telling this story, the only real plausible possible client for architecture, so to speak, or the locus for architectural speculation is the private sector. So in other words, you could say the developer has taken the place of the various sort of anonymous government bureaucrats as this sort of the agent in urban transformation, both in the imagination and on the ground. And this has been a self-reinforcing, self-perpetuating process. That's basically what Hope 6 is about. It's about giving grants and various tax incentives and so on to developers to take up the task of urban transformation that had been historically, for in a sense, better or worse, the responsibilities of the state. So we really would like to, in a sense, reframe that question, to pose it anew and ask specifically about other kinds of agency that can be imagined, in effect, outside the markets today, under these circumstances. So, yeah.
I had a quick question. In the introduction you had, I'm sorry, I forget your name.
Catherine.
You mentioned that the maintenance costs were unforeseen and grew very large. But in the film, it said that the 1949 Federal Housing Act stipulated that federal money couldn't be spent on maintenance of buildings. You could build buildings, but you couldn't spend money on maintenance. That seems really foreseeable and pretty simple to cause.
Well, it seems foreseeable, but it was an arrangement that was common at the time. So I think most public housing authorities are municipal corporations, so they function the way like bridge operators or bridge corporations that control bridges are, right? So they're constrained legally by the federal government. They have a relationship with the federal government. Their money goes in interesting directions. It goes in one direction and not another. So if these sites were built up through federal funds, the agreement was that, and the hope was that they'll be so full of people, and many of those people will be middle class, and many of them were to start with, right, middle class, that rent will float the maintenance costs, right? And that was the expectation. So at the time, I think it seemed like a perfectly logical arrangement, a way to sort of jumpstart, and you know, these sites jump-started local economies, even in the Depression, right, jump-started building trades that were people who were out of work and architects who were out of work. Some of the most stellar architects in Chicago built the housing projects in Chicago because they had no jobs during the time that they were built. So they stimulated the local economy, but there was no expectation that people would not want to live in them for more than, say, a decade. So
I mean, the question then for me is the lesson learned, well, public housing is more expensive than we thought it was?
Well, I think the lesson learned is that anything requires maintenance, right? I mean, I know that sounds really like there are older lessons here, right? That America has been organized spatially according to really difficult histories of racial segregation, right? That we have had crime epidemics that decimated our cities in the 70s and 80s, and I think what comes out of something like this is yes, anything requires maintenance, and money does go to subsidize housing in this country. It just depends whether it goes to housing for poor people or housing for private mortgages.
Right.
It's not as if privately subsidized mortgages are not also subsidized. Right? So it's thinking about where to shift those costs and where to put them. That perhaps is part of the issue. But I'm not a policy expert. It's the joy of being an anthropologist. You don't have to tell people how to fix it.
Yeah. Thank you. Laura.
I have the mic, so.
We got the mic.
I just want to maybe intervene in the narrative and the way that the narrative gets told, right? Because it's the same narrative over and over again for building and unbuilding and rebuilding and then unbuilding again, which starts with overcrowding, crime, poverty, right? So you demolish, then you make a solution, which is, rebuilding large swaths of the city, and then you don't plan for maintenance, and then crime, poverty, it's the same story over and over again. And so I wonder, Reinhold, you're talking about the narrative as one of publics. There's another, maybe there's another one which, and I actually don't even know how to frame it, but it would not be, it just would have to be a different narrative or asking different questions about that same cycle, right? So how do you redefine that same problem if the city has to grow, right? Cities have to grow. They're getting more and more crowded, and it's happening everywhere in the world, right? So if that same question just gets reframed the same way without asking questions about race and without asking questions about poverty or without asking questions about how the public intervenes, then perhaps you would get a different answer. I think, right? Because I think it's too cyclical, that same question, and it just repeats, and so that's why it repeats itself. Because it's not so much a question of scale. Scale has to change.
I just wanted to add to that. Not all cities are growing, right? And so what might, so where I work, cities are very much shrinking. So it's maybe thinking about, so maybe part of reframing this narrative, if I were thinking about pedagogy in architecture school, would be how do we question this assumption that cities endlessly grow? Right? How do we pull back on that assumption and think about what would it mean to shrink a city? What kind of work would that involve? And then what would our commitments be ethically to people who live there?
But usually the question of a shrinking city involves a growing city someplace else in the world, right? So it's become a much more global question that we have to ask, and I don't think you can solve the question of shrinking cities through, right? Through completely recycling people in and out of other kinds of terrible living situations.
Well, one thing I could add is, we could argue that housing has never really been the issue, in a sense, in the way that we mean, like, housing stock, so to speak, or the way it's designed. I mean, this was basically Engels' argument in the housing question when this was being debated in Europe in the late 19th century, that really what you're dealing with are class structures, and here we can now, add or elaborate this with the many other ways that the society is segmented, in this case principally along racial lines, and sort of ask ourselves, in effect, what really is structural here and what is, if not superstructural, then in a sense less determinant. But one thing that I would say, I and maybe this is something that it's connected back to your point about why this continues to sort of to challenge architects as a question, unless one is really going to be very, very reductive and deterministic about it and say, it's all about, it's the economy, stupid, that's it, right, or something like that, basically, some kind of determinism, then there is such a thing as the housing question, that housing in its materiality, in its, something as straightforward as an elevator, it's not maybe, let's say, instrumentally determining success or failure, but it's necessarily part of a necessary but not sufficient condition for something like success or failure. So the actual infrastructural character of these kinds of designs, whether they're large or small, I completely agree. Its scale is not necessarily the driving factor here, but I think this may be a way of putting the housing question back on the table in architecture, not just with respect to who pays for it and who maintains it and so on, but what is the relationship of the design and planning of housing and associated other activities vis-a-vis economic life, social, racial interaction, and so on. So, how to unravel the many determinisms that we have also narrated, and in the process of narrating ourselves out of the equation, as well as kind of over-investing in the heroic sense. So, yeah. John has a question. We probably should. Yeah. Do you have more things to say?
I have plenty of things to say.
Yeah. Well, you can keep going. Yeah, well, it's up to you. It's up to you. But let John. I know John's question.
I just wanted to add to what you were saying that there's the question of changing political coalitions. In addition to we've talked about form, we've talked about scale, we've talked about race, but these are the product of white working class political machines. Oftentimes these housing projects are the people that built them got jobs from the political machine, and that sort of growth that you were talking about was something that politicians were looking to benefit from. And as cities changed, and as white working class people moved outside of the municipality, those coalitions fell apart. And it seems to me, as much as the sort of material structure of the buildings and the questions of scale, that there's the question of changing political coalitions, which is that disappeared as well.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting to note in Chicago that the destruction of public housing has completely politically upset the entire landscape of the city politically, so that voting blocks that were possible to mobilize certain kinds of causes are completely decimated now, right? So not just a kind of political mobilization opportunity for white folks, but also very much for African Americans to sort of develop a political voice in a really efficacious way. So it'll be interesting to see where that political mobilization goes, if it goes anywhere, or if its conditions have been destroyed.
I know you have many other things to say. I certainly don't want to.
I'm mindful of holding you captive.
Short, but, I mean, maybe just some concluding thoughts. and there's more wine, and we can maybe informally discuss over the wine.
Well, sure. I guess I have been very interested. So this is a narrative. The interviews sound very familiar to me, and they will sound familiar to anyone who has either grown up in public housing or spent a lot of time working there or doing research there. So they're very familiar, and I've heard them for many years. That yes, there are difficult parts of living here, but there are also wonderful parts of living here, and I couldn't want to live anywhere else. And this is what I find so surprising is that this is a very shocking narrative for the rest of the American public to hear, and I'm wondering if people had thoughts about why this is such a surprising narrative to listen to and to witness.
I think people might be shocked because it might be something different than where they grow up. And all that I found is whatever travel and interviews and all the stuff that I've done, not related to this. People like being where they're from for the most part. People from St. Louis, even if they came from Pruitt-Igoe, they would look at living in New York for 10 years like the most crazy thing on the planet. For the most part, many people in places. There are people who live right up the river from Yards who go to Grafton, Illinois, and they live on the banks of the Mississippi and Illinois rivers. They have houses that are on stilts, that are up 20 feet. Because every 20 years, the river, the mighty Mississippi, called that for a reason. It's going to come and wipe out everything that's there. And they say, oh, help us, and then later on they come back and they look right there again when you know that it's going to flood and go away. The same with New Orleans. You saw people training. You saw people say, well, I don't want to leave. Same with people in Bangladesh. Some people may want to leave, but people don't want to leave where they're from. That's you. If you design, you can't design with human. You have to find a way to design with human mind, with whatever it is you're doing, with human behavior or human attitude. If you don't do that, then that would fail, I guess, as an architect. That's what like you were saying. But it's an elevator that can be maintained by people, whether or not the certain amount of funds will come through. It can be complicated, be modern, but it can't be so complex that it can't be funded. It can't go in after things are done. So that's the thing. That's one of the big flaws. A lot of the whole paternalistic political kind of compromises that had to go on. One, to even get this thing built. I have to read in so much of this. I can imagine the mentality of the folks to say, oh, yeah, we're going to give black people this over there, but guess what? We're leaving. We're certainly not going to fund anything else. You don't get TV. You don't get food. You don't get this. You might have started out blending. I guarantee you in 6 months, like they said there, oh, wait a minute, this is St. Louis. We got to remember what to do. And people split up and people started to go. We got more and more paternalistic, freedom like the kids. That can have 1,000% true, especially with people. Well, we gave you this. You shouldn't. So, I don't know. People don't like to do where they're from. Change is part of the whole
I feel that there is a much larger sense of community than I've felt like here. And I grew up somewhere really rural and small where we had a really strong sense of community, and I think that maybe why people go back to having good memories living in places like this is because they have something that doesn't exist as easily in urban environments, in my opinion.
So I think we have one more intervention, and
where certain people are actually making money by babysitting someone else's child, or you're doing someone else's laundry. So when projects like these get torn down and people get dislocated, then their basis of their life and their income and their economy is also crumbling apart as well. So I think that kind of adds to the idea of the two most came up words in the discussion was the flexibility and mobility, that it's kind of disabling them from being mobile in terms of not just getting to their job by placing jobs out in the suburb and these housing projects are beginning to happen, but also kind of bring them down to the zero level where they have to start over again. So there's no way of moving up to the ladder of the society where they can actually be able to afford a house and actually take the ownership of the house. I think which attributes to the whole maintenance issue as well, because if they actually had an ownership of a place, they're more likely to take care of the place, I think.
You know, I get the feeling that this is the kind of discussion that will persist when we're done. And really it should. I mean, that's really our goal. And so we thank you all for coming, and we invite you back to, well, we invite you down to MoMA, we invite you over to Low Library on Saturday and beyond to continue this discussion in many other ways. Thanks again. Thank you, Catherine.